Okay, great. Why don't we get started? This is, again, Stephen Donofrio with Forest Trends. And thank you so much to everybody who is already dialed in to the webinar and is able to view this on your screen or listening in by phone. We very much appreciate you taking the time out of your day. We know you all have a lot of things to do, and we hope to make this webinar useful to you. This is a launch webinar for a project that we at Forest Trends Supply Chain have been working on with Ceres over the past several months. It's called Zooming In. And while we've focused a lot of our reports and publications around a more general broad state of play of companies' commitments and commodity-driven deforestation, we took a very targeted focus on this project, looking at traceability specifically, and reviewing the data that we've been collecting and researching through our desk research process, but also with the data that we received from CDP through our partnership, to really understand how companies are addressing traceability, and particularly in relationship to their deforestation goals. So let me progress on to the next slide. I have a few opening remarks here that will guide a bit of the start of the presentation. The first is that we are planning to have this for about an hour. So there will very likely be questions. Usually there are. And when you do have those questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box. If you have any issues trying to find that, send a note into the chat the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen in the toolbar. We will be able to get to those at the end of the webinar. We'll have some time for the Q&A. But just to give you an overview of how the different speakers will present themselves and present their content. Julie Nash from Ceres will be joining us in just a moment. She will begin with an overview of the project, a backdrop of commodity-driven deforestation and traceability, and how this is really relevant for the investor community. I will then delve into the key findings of Zooming In, after which Julie will come back and share some recommendations that Ceres has for investors. Immediately following, Marissa from Green Century Capital Management will share insights from the perspective of an investor related to deforestation commitments and traceability. Jillian will wrap up the presentations with her insights and best practices as she sees them with her perspective of working at CDP. So if you are having any difficulties dialing in or accessing the webinar component of this, please let us know and we'll be happy to assist in any way possible. You can do that by, again, writing into the chat box. And we are recording this webinar, so we will send a link around in a follow-up email. It will also be available via the Forest Trends website, which you can get to by going to supply-change.org, and the pop-up that appears there will have a link that directs you to the holding page for this project on the Forest Trends website. And also one last note, you are muted, so you may have found that out by now, but you are muted as an attendee, in which case, please again, send any comments or questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. So with that, I will send it over to Julie, who will help get us going into the content of this webinar. So Julie, please, once we unmute you, please take it away.
So agriculture, including deforestation, is responsible for 19 to 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions, second only to the energy sector. And sometimes we forget about how large that is. And commercial agriculture drives at least 2/3 of tropical deforestation. Much of this is driven by the four large commodities of palm, soy, timber and pulp, and cattle. And much of this tropical deforestation is happening in specific hotspots, deforestation hotspots that we see across the globe. For companies who operate in these commodities, in these hotspots, these dynamics result in potential risks. So these risks range from market risks so that you have the potential of buyers removing their business, which we've seen in case studies such as IOI, or they could be reputational risks. And these are risks about adverse publicity, whether it's accurate or not. So as investors, as we look at the dynamics that are happening around deforestation, they increasingly recognize that these risks are material, and they're engaging with companies within their portfolio to help them develop risk mitigation strategies. And we believe that traceability is a key building block for understanding and addressing these risks. So this is why Ceres partnered with Supply Chain to analyze the traceability of ambitions of companies with deforestation commitments. And Stephen, I'll kick it back over to you for the results of the analysis.
Thank you, Julie. And a couple of just high-level overview points before I get in. I mean, we always like to thank our collaborators, CDP and WWF, and our steering committee, which is made up of individuals from UNDP, UNEP, and others. The Global Environment Facility is a major supporter of supply chains, and so a lot of this work that we do is merely intended for public consumption. We've, as I mentioned earlier, presented a lot of our information in publications and other documents, and so this is a really exciting opportunity for us to provide the data in a very specific context of investors. And so working with Ceres, and this is just another example of some of our alliances and collaborations that can really be successful in how we as supply chains can communicate the work that we do and the data that we have. So the project really began in mid to late last year in terms of reviewing company information. Supply chain over the last 4 years has grown from looking at just a couple of dozen companies to understand what their corporate ambitions are for addressing commodity-driven deforestation for those 4 commodities that Julie mentioned. We have since then grown to now tracking over 800 companies. And of those 800 companies, roughly 470 now, this 469 was at the time of the writing of this report. But the 470 companies that we now have profiles for, that means that they have at least one commitment for one of the commodities that they are exposed to. And then in addition to that, we tried to understand, okay, well, out of these 469 companies, how many have a commitment or some sort of policy or goal related to traceability? And in so doing, our team reviewed about 815 different statements from public documents. And those are documents that are both managed by the company themselves. So this could be a website, a sustainability report, annual report, or some other company-issued document. And also it's externally managed, reporting systems like CDP or RSPO and others. But really what we were, at the core trying to understand is what is the company communicating, how are they communicating it, and where are they communicating that information. So the 2 images you see to the right here, one is the executive summary that is going to be available on the website, if not already. And also a supplemental slide deck, which provides a lot more information than what you see in the 2-page executive summary. But it really builds upon the key findings that we'll be talking about here today. So the first thing to review is what we mean by commitment. And in our context of supply chains, we try to separate out a aspiration from a commitment. And the commitment reason why it needs to be separated out is because it does have specific details and key elements to create the ability to track the progress and the implementation of that goal. And so that could be key things like does that commitment or does that statement have a target date? Are there any quantifiable elements that can be tracked along the way? And so you see a few examples here of how companies have done this. And again, this is all taken from towards the end of last year when we wrote this, we wrote all this up. But the Marks and Spencer example to Olam, where there's a specific percentage of the commodity that is being traceable to perhaps a mill or some other part of the supply chain. And then what you see with Olam there is that they go another step and say, well, our goal is 2018, but in 2016, we will be 30% to the mill. So that's how we try to differentiate between a aspirational statement, which is something far off into the future or potentially undefined in terms of any of these criteria, and something that's very specific. So what you see on the bottom is that 98 of those 208 companies of the 470 roughly that we have commitments for have a traceability ambition. So that means that this is a commitment that you're seeing these examples here. 98 companies have some type of commitment that is similar to what you're seeing on the screen. The rest of those companies have aspirational statements. So what's interesting though is that, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, is that even some of these companies that haven't set clear timeframes for their commitments or percentages of achievement, they are reporting on progress related to implementing traceability programs. But at any rate, the just over half of these companies that have a traceability commitment are time bound. So moving on to what the next step of our analysis was, which is to understand that when a company has multiple different commodities within their supply chains or into their business operations, are they providing a traceability goal for all of those commodities? And what we see in other parts of the work that we do is that just broadly looking at how companies are addressing deforestation, it's not always consistent that the company will be addressing deforestation for all these 4 commodities that they might be exposed to. And so similarly, what we see with traceability is that less than 1% of companies that have a traceability commitment are covering all of the 4 commodities or any of the 4 commodities that they might be exposed to. So Mars here is an example of a company that is exposed to all of the 4 commodities and does have a traceability commitment for each. And then taking maybe a narrow focus on just the commodity versus commodity side, palm, we have found, accounts for over half of the traceability commitments that were made. And again, this aligns with our other findings that most of the commitments in the supply chains database are related to palm. And then also, this is now how we can try to gauge where companies are in achieving those commitments. And because we are looking at any public information that the company has reported and not asking for additional reporting to be made, we are looking at, as I mentioned earlier, channels that are managed by the company, as well as channels that are managed by external organizations. And so we bring all of that together into one synthesized and aggregated database. And these are, again, a few examples of how companies are reporting this information. And it's varied and it's very vast. And for some companies, it could be a couple of dozen different sources, and for others, it could be 1 or 2. But we wanted to take a look at that and really understand, where are companies reporting traceability statements? And we found that companies are reporting most often in their own managed channels. So 62% of statements are coming from company managed channels. And a small percentage of these companies are going a step further in providing their own customized, very highly detailed commodity-specific updates or dashboards on their own websites. And then when we look at these externally managed reporting systems, such as CDP, we find that traceability statements do appear there, and there's a lot of value in these externally managed platforms because of their standardization of the data requests and consistency in the reporting cycles. But really the key is to be able to understand, are they making progress on commitments? And this is for any stakeholder to really be able to appreciate the amount of work that goes into not only setting a goal, but working towards achieving it. And so we found that of those companies with traceability commitments, that just over half are communicating publicly about progress. This reassures investors, supply chain actors, NGOs, and other stakeholders. But that percentage is, while it's just over half, it's still a very low number of companies that are reporting progress on traceability. And there may be a number of factors related to that, which we're not going to get into here just in this part of the presentation. But it is worth trying to understand why is the reporting not happening, and how can we encourage more transparency, even if the news is not favorable. But like I said before, the companies that do not have a explicit commitment with a timeline or percentages, that several of these companies, 41 out of the 110 to be exact, are providing some degree of updates or progress related to their traceability programs, even if they don't have an explicit commitment. The next element here is to understand it to which landscape or supply chain level is traceability targeting. Because as we know, traceability is really being able to identify the key actors along that supply chain, so that you can be able to implement whatever corporate policies or other goals you might have. And these two examples are showing when companies are able to be very specific about a mill or plantation, that it does provide that clarity to their stakeholders about what exactly it is that they're trying to achieve. And we found that 36% of companies with traceability commitments are reporting that specific location. So is it the region, the country, state, port of entry, refinery, et cetera, all the way to specific plantations or ranches. And then most of these companies, 55%, are reporting traceability to the mill or tannery. So that is the most common supply chain level that companies are reporting to. And then taking this a step further, this is going back a bit to some of the statements made earlier, is that when we're looking at the scope of a company's reporting, are they talking about just generally the company as a whole, or are they speaking about specific high-risk facilities, suppliers, or regions? So the more targeted and specific that companies are, then the more that we're able to gauge the progress of their implementation of these goals. And so the few examples you see here do talk about specific company levels or suppliers and types of breakdowns of their traceability plans. But very few companies are committing to traceability with both that blanket corporate statement as well as a specified scope that addresses high-risk facilities, suppliers, or regions of operation. Over half of the companies are committing to traceability with a blanket statement, with only a blanket statement that covers the whole commodity footprint as its scope. So we need to be able to have comparability and an understanding of company versus company, but it is also important to have a company nuance specificity as well. And so we invite you to download both the executive summary as well as that supplemental slide deck. The two different URLs that you see there on the left-hand side of the screen are the ways in which you can do that. supply-change.org. There's a pop-up that will appear. You'll be able to click on the link there, which takes you to that second link of forest-trends.org. But the website is a free and public good, so we do invite you to search for companies or look up how your company is being presented and feed us back any information or insights that you might have that could be useful to us as we further build out supply chains and make what we do as useful as possible to our stakeholders. So with that, I'm going to bring it back over to Julie.
Thank you, Stephen. So to provide just a little bit of background, Ceres works to advance sustainability leadership among investors, really to drive solutions in the space. And we're currently partnering with PRI and with members, and Marissa will talk later, and with our own investors collectively. And the group manages $15 trillion in assets within the Ceres network. So we're working with these investors to help be able to define how these commitments can turn into on-the-ground action that really reduces the risk. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to outline from Stephen's work and the best practices for traceability. So I think that this echoes a lot of Stephen's comments. Commitments that are quantifiable and time-bound. Investors really recognize that publicly declaring a commitment's target date and establishing milestones can guide the development of an implementation plan and serve to keep traceability on the corporate agenda. As Stephen said, just over half of the traceability commitments were found to be time-bound. We're looking for commitments that are traceable across all commodities. And committing to traceability across one commodity is a good place to start. But to really mitigate the risks that are within these target commodities, within these called deforestation hotspots, companies must implement traceability programs against all of their major commodities, really to mitigate this risk. And currently only 1% of companies have this type of traceability commitment. We're also looking for companies to be able to disclose annually or more frequently their progress towards sustainability. Demonstrating progress through public reporting is critical to be able to reassure investors that stakeholders have the commitment, that companies have the commitment, and it's alive and well. And finally, we want to be able to make sure that the commitments trace the supply chain to the whole commodity footprint, or what we call landscape level. This detailed level of reporting can enable companies to understand where the issues are happening within their upstream location within their supply chain. And we recognize that this is a hard ask, but in order to be able to mitigate the issues that we see within these commodities, within these specific risk areas, it's very important to be able to have traceability across the whole commodity footprint. And currently only 1/3 of the companies with commitments report to this landscape level. So I would be happy to be able to answer questions at the end about these best practices and Ceres' commitment to them. But now I will turn it over to Marissa, who'll be able to talk about how these best practices and her point of view on traceability as she goes into engaging with companies.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Lefebvre. I'm a shareholder advocate at Green Century Capital Management, where I lead our forest protection program. I'm very excited to be discussing with you all today why deforestation risk and traceability are important to investors, as Julie mentioned. Green Century has been engaging companies on the risks related to deforestation since 2012. Back then, deforestation was a big deal, as in it was happening all around the world, but it had yet to cross into the public's and the investors' consciousness. People were just starting to demand transparency and traceability as they began to care more about the origins of their food and the products that they consume. In fact, in 2012, only 5% of palm oil refineries were covered by no deforestation policies. As of 2017, that number is now 74%. That's almost a jump of 70% in just 5 years. So this enormous shift was driven largely by consumer, investor, and competitive pressure, and shows just how important issues that may have once been considered fringe have now become. But the question really is, why do investors care, and what exactly are we looking for? Well, investors care because, as Julie and Stephen covered, companies that don't properly address and mitigate the risks linked to deforestation within their supply chains are vulnerable to material and financial risks. These risks include restricted market access, reputational damage, and the loss of goodwill, as was discussed. And if a company is vulnerable to these risks, so are our investments as investors in that company. And that's why really risks related to deforestation have become so important. So much so, as Julie mentioned again, that investors representing trillions of dollars of assets under management have joined initiatives to engage and press companies throughout the supply chain to address and mitigate deforestation. And just this month, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, the Norwegian Pension Fund, actually reported that it's engaging palm oil and soy companies on deforestation and has even divested from those that are linked directly to deforestation. Further, just a little tidbit of a story here, but several investors, including Green Century, have gone so far as to meet with companies in places like Indonesia to see what these no deforestation commitments that Julie defined actually look like on the ground. But of course, not all investors are able to tour the palm oil fields of Indonesia or the soy fields of Brazil, checking to make sure every single company they hold in their funds are not developing on deforested land. So that's why we as investors have to rely on strong no deforestation commitments, traceability systems, supplier assurance mechanisms, and reporting to adequately assess risk. I'll say it again, transparency, traceability, and communication with stakeholders are absolutely key for investors. Simply put, if a company isn't talking about something they're doing, we have to assume they're not doing it. And if a company can't trace its supply chain, we can't trust that any claims that they make about what is or isn't happening within it. Because if we don't know and they don't know, then how can they say they're doing anything at all? Julie already covered what a strong corporate commitment should look like, so I will talk briefly about what investors look for when we say traceability and supplier mechanisms. This can be found on the slide as well. But essentially, to ensure traceability, companies must have explicit commitments to traceability that are time-bound and include the entire value chain, both direct and indirect suppliers. These commitments should be reported on publicly using meaningful metrics that contextualize progress. So not only do we know that it's happening, we understand what that means in the grander scheme for the company. Further, companies should publicly outline the processes they have in place for assessing and verifying supplier compliance with their commitments, as well as the processes for sanctioning suppliers that are found to be non-compliant. Basically, we need to understand that companies are actually making sure that the changes they are requiring from their suppliers are actually happening within their supply chain. And if they aren't happening, what are they doing about it to make sure that they don't continue to source products and commodities that they have agreed not to source. Companies should generally measure and disclose overall supplier progress toward meeting these deforestation goals on a regular basis, at least annually, and should also have an understanding of the greater strategy and necessary benchmarks to ensure that they reach the commitments on time. As much as investors care about policies companies have in place, we care even more about the implementation of these policies, and that's why I'm harping so much on transparency and traceability. Commitments can, in a sense, be a short-term band-aid for risk, but mean nothing if they're not actually implemented. And if they're not implemented, the risk is still there, not only for the company, but again, for the investors and our investments in that company. So traceability, transparency, and reporting prove to us that a company is actually doing what it said it's set out to do. And that's why tools like supply chain and CDP are so crucial for investors to understand what's happening, but also to create positive change. I'm happy to elaborate on any of the topics I just covered during the Q&A, but thank you all for your time.
Great. Thanks, Martha. I am going to pick up here and talk a little bit about the perspective from CDP on traceability and some of the other important best practices that my colleagues or co-presenters have talked about already on the line. My name is Jillian Gladstone. I'm with CDP. I sit in our North America office and engage with reporting companies, investors, and other stakeholders who are interested in deforestation here in North America. I'm really happy to be joining the webinar today as a speaker, so thanks to the organizers for having me. CDP is really happy to be a partner of Supply Chain. We've worked with them for about 3 years now, really closely. And many of you on the line may know CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. You may know our work primarily as a reporting and disclosure platform. We're also a framework for action. And so we work with companies to help them report, track, manage, measure their environmental impacts related to climate change, water, and deforestation. This past year in 2017, 272 companies disclosed through CDP's forest disclosure request. And a big chunk of that data that's disclosed publicly underpins some of Supply Chain's public profiles and analysis. So that's kind of how we come to this, and I'm partnering with the other folks on the line today. So like I said, in addition to being a disclosure platform, CDP also lays out a framework for action for companies. We help to create sort of a blueprint for action that takes companies from assessing their current relationship with a given commodity, assessing risk and materiality, to setting ambitions through their corporate policies, commitments, and targets, and then to realizing that ambition by laying out the activities that can help companies achieve them. And then importantly, of course, we help companies track their progress year on year. So we do things like help companies set priorities and incentivize best management practices, particularly around the implementation of those deforestation commitments. And, you know, Julie did a good job of talking about some of the sort of best management practices related to traceability. So I won't go into detail on that, though I'm happy to talk about CDP specific guidelines and incentives around traceability if there are questions at the end. But really what I wanted to talk about were some of the insights that we gain from seeing companies report out on how they are achieving traceability in their supply chains. So one key insight for us is that traceability is one of the tools that companies are using to track their own progress towards meeting their goals. You know, we need these indicators of how companies are achieving the goals that they've set for themselves. And traceability to the point of origin allows customers to understand the source of the commodities that are in their supply chains. You know, we sometimes overlook this link when we talk about commitments and implementation, but for many companies, there's still a lot of work to be done to simply understand what's happening in their supply chain and how the materials that they produce and sell are being produced. So, you know, we see this as a really essential first step in sort of the information gathering stage that a company goes through. Second, around sort of insights for us, CDP's found that traceability is actually linked pretty closely with business opportunities. So in the data that companies reported to CDP in 2017, we found that 94% of companies with traceability systems for at least one commodity are able to recognize business opportunities associated with the sustainable production or consumption of that commodity. And that's compared with only 47% of those companies that don't have traceability. So almost a doubling of those companies that are using traceability are able to recognize business opportunity as well. So, you know, there's a clear link between kind of the business case for action and this particular tool that companies are using. And so that's really important, I think, to highlight here. You know, that said, I do think it's important to keep in mind that traceability systems don't guarantee that the commodity in question is sourced from a sustainably managed source. Instead, what they provide is visibility to where the commodity is sourced or produced. And so for that reason, we talk a lot with companies, investors about the kind of the other best practices that go along with traceability that are required to ensure a sustainable supply. And you know, this has already been mentioned, but because traceability and certification schemes may not on their own be sufficient to ensure sustainable sourcing, we see supplier engagement as absolutely crucial, an additional tool that companies can use to implement those sustainable commodity sourcing commitments they've made. So supply chain engagement offers a means for companies to work with suppliers to improve practices and build on the information that they learn through their traceability efforts. And then finally, and I'm echoing Marissa here, we really need to think about how this information is being communicated to stakeholders. I was really interested in two of the findings from this research. The report finds that just over half of companies with traceability commitments are communicating publicly about their progress. I think they say in the report that demonstrating progress through public reporting is critical for reassuring investors, and we absolutely agree with that. So that number, just being over half of the companies communicating publicly, shows that there's still a lot of room for improvement here. And then the second finding that really stood out to me was that traceability statements are most likely to be communicated through channels managed by a company itself. And that was 62% of companies are reporting on traceability that way. And that's versus only 28% of companies that are reporting on their traceability efforts through externally managed channels. And so I see this as sort of a call to action. I think there's a critical need for increasing disclosure in a uniform, standardized way that provides context to stakeholders. So while traceability information alone provides valuable information about the source of a company's supply, it's important to contextualize this with what policies and commitments the traceability is aiming to address, as well as other actions a company is taking to use this traceability information to ensure sustainable purchasing practices are put in place. As I said earlier, we at CDP saw 272 companies disclosing on deforestation in 2017, most of them to investors who, along with corporate customers, are a key audience for this information. And we're really pleased to see such enthusiastic investor interest in this topic. Investors on the line today. We at CDP have more than 650 institutional investors that are the signatories to the deforestation information requests that companies receive. Those investor signatories have a combined $87 trillion in assets behind this request. So, that's really heartening to see this interest from stakeholders, but we would love to see that the number of companies actually disclosing and the level of disclosure on traceability and all of the other important implementation tools increasing in the coming year. So I would encourage those on the line to continue to ask the companies that they engage with for more information about how they're managing this work, and would be happy to take any further questions at the end of the webinar about how CDP can help facilitate that process.
Great, thanks, Julie, and thanks to everyone. If we could have all the panelists unmuted, and then we'll be able to get these questions going. There's a couple that have rolled in on the chat box. The first is potentially a question for Marissa. Which is looking at Neste Oil's 100% traceability to palm oil plantation. And the reason why I'm sort of presenting it to you is because the key follow-up question here is, have we investigated it? Because it sounds overly ambitious. And I want to clarify that supply chain, when we go through our process, we are not validating or verifying any of the information that companies are reporting to us. But instead, we are presenting in a consolidated aggregate way of what companies have reported about their goals and commitments and strategies. So I will maybe hand it over and see if, Marissa, you had any comments about this, and potentially in light of the work that you do as an investor, to dig deeper into what sits behind company reports.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to, and it's a great question, really. I mean, that's really what I was getting at throughout my presentation, is that we can't just rely on what the company says they do. We have to make sure they're actually doing it. And I mean, we are somewhat limited as investors. You know, I mean, we invest in the company or we don't, and we engage with the company or we don't. And at a certain point, we cannot be the ones that are actually auditing. We can't be the ones with drones on the ground in the areas that we're speaking of to ensure the company is doing this. But that's kind of why it's so important to us that the commitments that the companies make are so detailed, they're time bound, they're quantitative, and the company continues to report on it. So, for example, if we engage a company on a no deforestation commitment, or if they don't have one, on creating one and implementing it, we ensure that we keep up to date with the company. We check in every 3-6 months and ask them, what evidence, what data do you have to prove to us that you are actually doing what you've agreed to do? And if they can't prove to us to a certain extent that is comfortable for us, we might then go back and start the whole process again and file a shareholder proposal at the company, asking again for increased reporting, increased transparency. And there are often times when we're on the phone or in person with companies and they tell us all of this wonderful information and they give us all of this evidence of all of the great work that they're doing. But the next step from there is to ask them, well, make it public. If you're really doing this, then why can't you show everyone else that you're doing this? Because it doesn't really matter too much to us if they share with us privately, because that, again, we can't be sure then they're actually doing it. We can't assure, there's no way for any other investor to ensure that the company is doing it. So we never rely on privately shared information. We always press the company to kind of put evidence out there, and if the evidence isn't strong enough, then we'll keep, in some senses, badgering them and going back to ensure that they're actually doing it. I touched upon the trips that Green Century took to Indonesia. We've now gone twice, actually, to meet with palm oil producers on the ground at their palm oil plantations and discuss with the chief sustainability officers and the other people in the C-suite exactly what their policies are translating to on the ground. So, of course, we can't do that with every company we engage with, but it's those types of tangible, just realistic and quantifiable evidence that we really look for as investors.
Thanks. So at Ceres, we really believe that traceability and supplier engagement go hand in hand, and I think that Jillian spoke to this very well. So we are looking for traceability to show that there's an awareness of where their product comes from, and then strong supplier assurance. And some of this Marissa went over in terms of the looking for assessment and verification of supplier compliance with the policies, and disclosure of the overall progress towards the deforestation goals. So I think that these commitments need to be followed up with traceability commitments and then supplier assurance to make sure that that they're being followed through with. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Julie. And there are a few more questions here. So the next question has been addressed to me, I think, but I think it's all for us to be able to answer. And it's looking at the Unilever announcement that came out, I guess it was about a week and a half ago, talking about both the traceability as well as transparency around suppliers and mills that they source from. I believe it was for palm oil. How significant is this announcement, and what is the take of the panel on how radical this announcement truly is? I'll say just very briefly from our perspective, but then we'll open it up for anybody else, is that the effectiveness of supply chains will only increase as more and more companies make information available. So transparency is key to ensuring that supply chains has information to build itself upon. And that also relates to companies throughout the supply chain. So as we can identify more and more actors along the supply chain, not just those that are headquartered in Europe and North America, where we have the abundance of companies in the platform with commitments, but that are more in those producer countries, then the more information we'll be able to have around, really truly the implementation and progress towards these goals. So that's very helpful that that information's been made available. It's not the standard based on our research. We welcome more companies to provide that level of transparency. There is a question here also about maybe linked to this, which is where is the greatest opportunity for investors to engage with companies? We heard about shareholder resolutions and other things, but I think where to get some tangible numbers, for example, around what that business risk actually means, how do you, as an investor or investor group, communicate that to companies that may not be totally aware, and then help drive action?
So, Stephen, I could take a stab at that, and then maybe Jillian also has some insights on the risk from CDP's standpoint also. So one of the things that we've done at Ceres is engaged with investors to try to be able to outline the risks and come up and develop case studies that actually show the risk that we talked about in terms of the financial impact of reputational risk, of a market risk. And so we've developed a series of case studies that actually shows the material impacts. And so one of those is IOI. And so one of the things that we've done is we've outlined in our discussions with investors the risks that can happen specifically to traders when their customers sign on to things like the Serato Manifesto, or their customers have these no deforestation commitments like they do in Palm. So I think that there's opportunities across the supply chain. When it comes to risks, we have some very strong case studies focusing in on traders, producers, and manufacturers. And we can send out the link to that information. It's on Engage Chain, which is a website of ours, but we can send that link out to individuals that kind of shows our investor guide for deforestation risk. And Jillian, I know that you work on and look to be able to quantify investor risk. So maybe if you could add on to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something that we do each year. We sort of take stock based on what companies are reporting through their CDP forest disclosure of kind of what is the risk level that's really out there for companies and for investors. As I think, both Marissa and Julia have pointed out, risk to companies is risk to their investors. What we found from the 2017 disclosures through CDP is that $941 billion is dependent on commodities linked to deforestation. And that's as reported by companies. That's not, our own analysis. That's what companies are actually self-reporting as the value of revenue that is dependent on those commodities and therefore is, at risk if they're not able to secure a sustainable source of those commodities. 87% of companies reporting identify risks from deforestation, and nearly a third, so 32%, say they're already experiencing impacts on their business from those risks. So we know that the risk is really tangible and it's very real and it's already manifesting in some, concrete ways. So, I think that's the first thing that, for us, it's really important that investors understand this is a, sort of a present risk, not something that we're thinking about down the road. And then I would say that in terms of, places for investors to engage, there are a few things. In addition to, of course, we encourage investors to request disclosure from investee companies. We've talked about that a lot on the webinar today, but it is crucial that they use public reporting and disclosure as a way to understand what's actually happening in these companies and the risk that they are exposed to. And then, direct engagement can take a lot of forms, and, Julie and Marissa have shared some of those. I think think investors engage directly in a lot of different ways. But, another place where I would encourage investor engagement or investor sort of action on this topic is for investors themselves to actually draft a deforestation policy. That's an important step that we're seeing from some investors, but I think it's important because it allows investors to lay out, their own sort of plan of action and their own standards that they are going to perform to in their own investing. So, I think that is a critical step that maybe not every investor has yet sort of thought about taking. And then finally, I would just point folks to sort of lengthier document that CDP put out at the end of last year with the Global Canopy Program. And it's actually a guideline for investor financial institution guidance on how to engage companies on deforestation risk. And so in that document, we lay out a couple of sort of sections, on expectations of companies and then specific questions that financial institutions can ask the board of the companies in which they invest or lend to. And those fall into a couple of buckets around transparency disclosure, board oversight of risk, company policies, and strategy implementation. And perhaps we can actually send this around in a follow-up if it might be useful to the folks on the line.
Jillian, this
Thanks,
is Julie. Oh, sorry. I realized that I probably didn't say one of the active ways. So Ceres is partnering with PRI on a sustainable forests working group where we are engaging with institutional investors in the palm oil market and also within soy and cattle in South America. So we have existing engagements that are spinning up now. And if anyone has any questions on ways that they can become involved with those working groups and those engagements with the companies within those areas, I would encourage them to be able to reach out to us because we have ways that you can make impact immediately and structures that allow for lead investors and for investors who are just starting within the engagement process. So thank you, Jillian. That reminded me to be able to outline what it is that we're doing right now at Ceres.
No problem.
Thanks for that additional information, Julie. And Marissa, unless you have anything burning to add, maybe we can move on to another question.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great. So this other question that's come in is around how we distinguish between companies along the supply chain. So what are the expectations for a company that might be a retailer versus a manufacturer, trader, processor, et cetera? Are we looking for the same level of traceability ambition by all companies across that supply chain? And if so, why? Or if not, what might be those nuances? And just to let everybody know before anybody on the panel takes that, in the supplemental slide deck, we do break down by supply chain level companies' traceability goals.
Stephen, this is Jillian. Maybe I can just start by really quickly laying out what CDP's expectation is, because it's straightforward. We do ask companies to report, depending on where they sit in the supply chain, differently. So the big distinction for us is retailers versus essentially everyone else in the supply chain. We expect producers, traders, and manufacturers to trace to, and it depends on the commodity. So in paper and pulp, we're talking to the mill level. For logs, we're talking to the forest management unit level, and et cetera, through the commodities. But for retailers, we're asking them to report to the country and region level, but not beyond that. And that was the 2017 reporting expectation?
Julie. So I think that we definitely concur in terms of CDP. We focus a lot on manufacturers. I think the distinction that we might make in terms of retailers is those that they produce themselves. But from a risk standpoint, I can still say that even for retailers, it's important to be able to understand where your product comes from, because there are many times that risk, in specifically reputation risk, can be linked directly back to a retailer. So we recognize that it is hard and it's a hard undertaking, but to be able to understand whether you come from these areas that are high deforestation and high risk for commodities, we think it's important to be able to have that same kind of traceability within the supply chain. I hope that that's clear.
And this is Marissa, just lastly to finish off on that, we agree with CDP and with what Ceres does throughout the supply chain. But just to be clear, we also work with companies throughout the supply chain on deforestation. We think it's as important for them to have as robust policies as maybe the manufacturers or the producers at the upper levels of the supply chain. We think that even retailers and brands have just as much risk and face as much risk as the others, and we still engage them. And there's also the opportunity for those companies lower in the supply chain to press their suppliers and press other companies above them to implement similar policies if they're also being pressed to do so.
Thank you. And just looking at the time and acknowledging that we gave ourselves an hour for this call, and we want to respect everybody else's time, we can help facilitate any additional question and answering after the call, after this webinar. There is a very brief survey when you close out. So if you do have just a couple of extra minutes to answer that, that would be great. But I do want to just thank everybody that dialed in. I want to thank Julie and Marissa, as well as Jillian. Having your insights on this is really helpful. Our role in bringing information together and creating these reports and doing this, it really is done most effectively through collaborations and partnerships. So we're very excited that this is now publicly launched. If you go to supply-change.org, you'll see that pop up, and if you click on the link, you'll see both the executive summary as well as the supplemental slide deck. And a couple of things that were not talked about here, but are there, is we looked at scoring of companies that are done by what we call relevant assessments. And we found that there's a handful of those that are very specifically scoring companies on traceability. So we highlighted who those are and what exactly they're looking at. And then there's a few other things that we looked at in terms of the company structure, public versus private. What's the breakdown of companies in those categories that are having commitments or potentially not setting commitments for tracking or tracing their supplies, and a few other things. So please do feel free to follow up with us if you have any additional questions. I want to thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of your day.